So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and students. I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to this event. I'm Neil Brenner. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department, and I'm interim chair of the Committee on Geographical Sciences here at the University of Chicago. I'm really thrilled and delighted to welcome everyone to this afternoon's panel on climate and the legacies of empire. This event is organized by a working group of faculty here at the University of Chicago, and we're collaborating on a proposal to establish CEGU, the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization. I serve as one of the faculty organizers of the CEGU proposal, and so I would like to open this event with just a few very brief words about the work that is underway and which we're all very excited about. We've been working on this proposal for about 1.5 years. So this event is actually the first public engagement with the issues that we hope to explore in our committee. So it's really a very happy day for us. We're thrilled and delighted and really joyous to be able to begin to discuss some of these issues, not only within our faculty working group, but in a public setting. CEGU is a proposal that's been developed by a group of faculty based in the Division of Social Sciences, the Division of Humanities, and beyond at the University of Chicago. And all of us are basically very concerned with issues about society and environment across space and time, especially in relation to contemporary, planetary, and local environmental emergencies associated with climate change and biodiversity loss, among other urgent issues. We envision CEGU as a robust interdisciplinary platform for social science and humanities and interdisciplinary research and pedagogy around these issues. We seek to investigate and respond to the environmental crises of our time, not only by advancing climate change awareness and environmental literacy, but by actively centering questions about socio-environmental dynamics, conflicts, and crises in the knowledge formations that animate the social sciences and the humanities. We're interested then not only in the investigation of society and environment across space and time, but in the question of how we might renovate our approach to such issues, both in research and in teaching, in order to understand more adequately the proliferating environmental emergencies that we are living through today. The CEGU Faculty Working Group believes that such intellectual renovation is urgently important, not only for scholarly purposes and for teaching, but really in relation to some of the most pressing practical problems of our moment related to global warming, biodiversity loss, and the devastating, highly uneven social consequences of these processes around the world. As we explore possible pathways away from our entrenched dependence upon fossil fuels, we urgently need new frameworks of analysis to facilitate our understanding of our contemporary predicament. How did we get into this predicament such that we can hopefully transcend it, hopefully in a more environmentally sane direction towards a more environmentally sane form of collective social and political existence. We hope and anticipate that CEGU will become a lively space of scholarly exchange, research, and pedagogical exploration where faculty and students will collaborate in wrestling with such issues. We seek to bundle together the many wonderful capacities that already exist at this university within the social sciences, the humanities, and beyond in these areas, while also, we hope, creating new spaces in which such capacities can be further deepened and extended in response to ongoing intellectual and societal challenges. Let me also just briefly mention that several additional events are planned connected to our faculty working group as part of the current series, of which this is the first event. And these will deal with topics including energy history and geographies with Julie Klinger and Thea Rio-Francos, environment, democracy, and social movements with Megan Black and Alyssa Battistoni, animals, territories, and environments with Matthew Gandy and Mindy Schneider, all of whom will be in dialogue with members of the CEGU Faculty Working Group. And further details about these events, as well as registration information, can be found on our preliminary website, which, as most of you probably already know, is cegu.info. That's cegu.info. So these panels are intended to open up discussions about the vast intellectual and pedagogical terrain that we aim to explore in CEGU in the years ahead. Our faculty working group is meanwhile further developing the details of our proposal, especially in relation to areas such as undergraduate pedagogy. We're planning a doctoral certificate, as well as other ideas related to graduate programming and agendas related to faculty research and various kinds of public outreach. Our proposal will be receiving additional feedback from our colleagues around the university during the weeks and months ahead, and we will definitely be making further announcements about future plans as soon as we are in a position to do so. For students who are joining us today from the University of Chicago, please know that we will shortly be organizing some discussion fora in order to share further details about what we have in mind, and of course also to hear your feedback and your ideas about the directions that we might want to go with this work. Finally, before starting the actual panel, some words of thanks are in order. I want to thank all of the faculty involved in the CEGU faculty working group. We're now above 30 faculty, and all of you have put in a lot of time and energy into the discussions that have brought us to this point. I'm deeply grateful. I want to thank my fellow CEGU executive committee members, Frederick Albritton Janssen of the history department, Alan Collada of anthropology, Sabina Sheck of the program on global environment, and Lisa Wedeen of political science. We've all had many, many hours of meetings and discussions, and I'm deeply grateful to all of you for your commitment. I want to thank Carlo Diaz, our project and communications coordinator, who's done a brilliant job with logistics and communications in this work. And I also want to convey special thanks for wonderful support, advice, and encouragement at divisional and collegiate levels to Amanda Woodward, the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences, to Howard Nussbaum, the Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division, and to Jim Sparrow, who's the former master of that division. And they've all just been wonderfully supportive of this work, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate in hopefully many years to come. Finally, thanks to the GANS Fund, which is connected to the university's longstanding commitment to geographical studies and teaching, for helping us cover the various costs associated with this panel series. So I will now turn over our proceedings to my wonderful and brilliant colleague, Professor Elizabeth Chatterjee, a faculty member in the history department here at the University of Chicago, who has been a steadfast comrade, friend, and collaborator on all aspects of CEGU since we began brainstorming about this project about 18 months ago. Professor Chatterjee's research focuses on energy history in the global South, especially with regard to India's path from coal dependence to solar power. She has published a number of important articles on such topics in major scholarly journals, and she has a book in progress titled Electric Democracy, which traces the flows of electricity to provide an energy-centered history of India's transforming political economy since independence. Thanks again to everyone for being here, and Liz, over to you.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's an enormous privilege to be here. And as I hope that made clear to you all in our audience, you too, we hope, will be part of our nascent CEGU community. And I look forward to seeing you at all the other events and getting involved with you in all sorts of different ways. So today, our inaugural panel, I think, could not be more timely in tackling what I think is one of the most interesting and contentious debates in the whole of environmental studies. That is the relationship between climate change, empire, and its long legacies and afterlives. So just to frame this a little bit, perhaps I could borrow and modify somewhat from the philosopher Stephen Gardner. Gardner famously called climate change the perfect moral storm, and he flagged a set of moral dilemmas it raises, dilemmas across time, across space, and in terms of theory making. I think that we see all of those especially sharply when we talk about climate and empire. So when we talk about time, of course, climate change really does cross time. On the most basic physical level, some of the carbon dioxide that we in our SUVs or on our Zooms in Chicago release into the air, into the Earth's atmosphere, may remain for as long as 100,000 years. So in that way, the air itself, to borrow a phrase from Sunil Amrit, one of our speakers here, the air itself is an archive of historical responsibility of times past. But even more than this, as soon as we think beyond just climate change as a set of symptoms to actually the diagnosis of how we got here, we get even more into questions surrounding the role of empire and its afterlives. So, for example, the novelist Amitav Ghosh, in his recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, follows the nutmeg, which itself looks like a tiny planet, to argue that actually it's through the changes brought by European imperial expansion around the world that we see the beginnings of a very new way of humans interacting with non-human nature and organizing it for extraction and accumulation. For the second of Gardner's dilemmas, this is a spatial dilemma as well. Global warming, as it used to be known before Republican pollsters got hold of it, really is global. What happens in Chicago has impacts all around the world. And yet, as Stephen Gardner pointed out, our morality is not global. Our political system is not designed to think in global terms. Climate change is already happening, but it can feel very, very distant from us, from the peoples and the places who are absolutely bearing the brunt. The lasting legacies of imperial inequalities, then, is another part of what we've got to grapple with. And third is Gardner's point about the theoretical complexity of climate change. It really challenges us to make new use of concepts and theories and moralities in ways we've not before. What does it mean to bring into the same frame, say, the global financial system, as Keston Perry, our second guest here, with the atmosphere and the changes happening to it? How do we start to grapple with all of these different modes of agency and different temporalities and scale as we go? I genuinely cannot think of any better guests to wrestle with some of these dilemmas with tonight than the two that we have here together, to think about these themes of historical responsibility, of inequalities across space, and as well theory making from unexpected locations in the world. So our first speaker is Sunil Amrit. He's the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale University. He's also the winner of the 2016 Infosys Prize in the Humanities, and in 2017 was named a MacArthur Genius. Sunil's research really extends across a panoply of both subjects and spaces. So from environmental history to the history of migration and diaspora, the history of public health and global governance. And his work is especially focused on the Great Crescent from Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, through to South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, but even more so beyond. I don't want to intimidate you with a list of his publications, so I'll just pick out two favorites of mine. The first is Crossing the Bay of Bengal, The Furies of Nature and the Fortunes of Migrants, published by Harvard University Press in 2013, and the winner of the American Historical Association's John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History. It is a dazzling book. It brings together a genuine engagement with the Bay of Bengal as an oceanic space, with deep sympathy for the plantation workers, the sailors, the merchants, the sex workers, and more who've plied its currents. Sunil's most recent book is just as good. Unruly Waters, published by Basic Books and Penguin in 2018, explores the struggle to understand and control the monsoon in South Asia and beyond, and touches upon everything from climate science to big dams. I urge you to buy both of them. And he's going even more ambitious with his next book. He's currently working for W.W. Norton and Alan Lane on an environmental history of the modern world. So Sunil, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Our second guest is Keston Perry, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Williams College. in Massachusetts. He was previously a lecturer in economics in the University of West England and a postdoctoral scholar at the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts. Keston Perry's work examines the role of race in climate change and its policy implications. Much of his work in particular has focused on the global financial system that underpins international climate policy. In particular, I think Keston's work is outstanding in highlighting how global institutions and governing arrangements reproduce marginalization and dispossession, with a particular focus on the Caribbean and African diaspora, exposing how racialized communities in the Caribbean are really particularly made vulnerable to dispossession, debt, and death in the context of the climate crisis. He also very powerfully makes a case for climate reparations, something that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about today. I urge you to read his excellent recent articles in a number of leading international development journals, including Geoforum, Politics, and Development and Change. So as I say, this is an amazing pairing to have. Just a couple of words on format. The first thing I'm going to do is I'll pass for our two speakers to give us their take on this frame, climate and the legacies of empire. We'll then chat, the three of us, for about half an hour more. But really the last third, at least, of this event is all about you guys in the audience. So be preparing your questions. Shortly before we open up, I'll let you know that the chat is open and absolutely pile in your questions for both of these wonderful speakers. Without further ado then, Sunil, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Liz, for a very kind introduction. Thank you to Neil and Frederick as well for inviting me. This is really exciting to be here and really happy to be in conversation with Keston on these issues. Liz, you talked about empire and its afterlives, and I think that's a really nice sort of opening for me, because I think it's probably worth distinguishing between two approaches to this question of climate and the legacies of empire. I think the first, which of course Amitav Ghosh amongst others has really sort of delved into recently, is the question of how far empires, early modern and modern European empires specifically, played a constitutive role in creating the climate crisis. And there the connection is really causal. I think a second way in which we can think about this is to think about how the legacies of empire have shaped the unequal and fractured world that now confronts the climate crisis. These two lines of inquiry, of course, aren't mutually exclusive. I think they intersect, but they may be worth distinguishing, as you put it, between studying empire and climate and studying the afterlives of empire and climate. The question of how far imperialism caused the conditions for the climate crisis, I think, is bound up with the active, unresolved question of when the climate crisis began and what sort of crisis it is. Is it a systemic crisis that arose from the commodification of nature inherent in early capitalist expansion? Is it a crisis precipitated by fossil energy, first and foremost? Is it a later 20th century crisis, or at least acceleration? Of course, that's also bound up with what we call it. I think the nomenclature debate can get a little bit circular. I'm not going to go into it now. Maybe we'll come back to it in questions. But I do think that to disentangle the imperial origins of any one of these trajectories takes us back to some of the most vital and enduring debates about the legacies of empire, debates that originated in empire and anti-colonial movements themselves. And these are not new debates, and I think they're kind of getting a new lease of life. But let me focus on the second part of the sort of pairing I set up at the beginning, because my own work has focused much more on the sense in which imperial legacies have shaped the unequal and contested social as well as material landscapes that would confront the climate crisis when it became manifest in the later 20th century. To put it another way, a key concern of mine, which I think I share with you, Liz, is to think about empire and climate, but also to think about decolonization and climate and what that might mean. And I think one observation that comes out of that is that from the beginning, there was a conscious anti-colonial political project to name the legacies of empire in order to transcend them. And that I think the nature of that diagnosis has had profound material consequences. So it's well known that Mahatma Gandhi, to take one example, identified the imperial legacy in the most capacious terms as the whole edifice of acquisitive individualism that would have to be overcome if substantive freedom was ever to be won. God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization in the manner of the West, he wrote in 1928. For if an entire nation of 300 million people took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. But the point is really, I think, that Gandhi's was a lonely and idiosyncratic voice. By far the more widespread critique of imperial legacies is that empire had failed to bring industrial modernity, had retarded industrial modernity in Asia, and I'm talking about the parts of the world I know best. And the counterclaim was that Asian leaders would do so faster and more effectively. In thinking about what the condition was that had to be overcome in order to achieve freedom, I think nature was actually really quite central. One phrase resounds in Indian debates from the first half of the 20th century, and that phrase is the tyranny of nature. That what the freedom struggle would achieve, amongst other things, along with political sovereignty, was freedom from the tyranny of nature. That was a phrase of Nehru's, but many others used it. More specifically, there was frequently reference to liberating the Indian cultivator from the monsoons. So there is another sort of way of thinking about imperial legacies and climate, very much yoked to a conscious political project. And I think this was put most starkly by the Japanese philosopher Tetsuro Watsuji, who was writing in the late 1920s. He wrote a book on climate and society, climate and culture, a very deterministic book in many ways, quite representative of a kind of climatic determinism of the early 20th century. What he said about India is very striking. He said, in order for India to progress, and I quote, change depends on the conquest of climate. Change depends on the conquest of climate. And so if I may borrow and adopt a chapter title from my colleague Sam Moyne, I think we can see very clearly why anti-colonialism was not, for the most part, an ecological movement. And this is where, Liz, I think I find your notion of late acceleration so generative and so helpful to think with, because I think for most of the global South, the great acceleration was a promise. It was an aspiration that was not coming fast enough. Notably, I don't think there was ever, I've very rarely, if ever, seen from any part of the global South denial of climate change in sharp contrast to the global North. What you see rather is, I think, a deferral to social and economic needs, always with a sense that it may be too late. Indira Gandhi's famous speech at Stockholm in 1972, I think, captures that sense very well. She says, we're fully aware of the environmental crisis, but we have an even more urgent crisis of poverty. And we hope that it's not too late for us to be able to sort of square those things. So if there's a takeaway from my work, I think it is that the legacies of empire made it such that the climate crisis, when its effects began to be felt, was inevitably a multiplier, accelerating a whole series of ecological and social crises that were already well advanced. One of the ways in which I've looked at that is through water, the ways in which the climate crisis exacerbates and turbocharges a whole series of water crises in South Asia that have discernible origins in colonial hydrology and engineering and law. And I think one of the real roles a project like SIGU could play is to stand against what the distinguished geographers Louisa Mason and Jonathan Rigg call climate science reductionism, which they describe as a tendency to extract climate change from its social and economic context, to see it as a disembodied process acting on an undifferentiated world. And this is my final point. I think to their discussion, we could add that an important part of that reductionism is an ignorance of history. And let me conclude with just one last example from my work, which has looked at the relationship between migration and environmental change. We hear a lot about climate migration, about climate refugees. Taking seriously imperial legacies, I think, reminds us of a few crucial things. First, in the face of the climate crisis, forced immobility is at least as likely as flight. The second is that whether or not migration is a viable route to safety for people whose lives are under threat depends on many things, all of them a residue of history. Routes of migration are constrained, they are highly patterned, and they have embedded in them hierarchies of race, religious community, and belonging that are in profound ways, I think, legacies of empire. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And Keston, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, that was such a lovely beginning, and I'm really hopeful that we get into to pick out and unpick some of the threads that you've left for us, Sunil, sorry. So I want to begin by, well, I want to thank you, Liz, for, as well as Neil Brenner and all your colleagues as part of the SIGU group. I think this is a wonderful initiative. And I think there is a lot, just starting from this conversation, for us to work together and actually nurture, hopefully. I would like for us first to reflect on the current context of the ongoing pandemic. There are many people who believe that it is over. I tend to think, because of the rising numbers of deaths, especially in global South countries, and even here in the United States, that it is not over. But I want us to think about much of the discussion we've heard around the pandemic reinforcing many divisions, both within society, but also at a global level. We can see that these divisions do not only relate to geographical borders or geographical contours, but around issues of power, ideology, technology, finance, as well as political and social power. So one of my favorite Caribbean economists, Norman Girvan, who passed away a few years ago, pointed this out in a 2014 article where he was taking a historical perspective on extractive imperialism, where he quotes Lloyd Best, who is we could call him a co-conspirator of his at that point in time, where he said that when Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he thanked God and inquired urgently after gold. Nowadays, the investors arrive by jet clipper. They thank the Minister of Pioneer Industries and inquire after bauxite. I think this particular suggestion leads us into how we can discuss both the divisions the pandemic has reinforced. I don't think those disappeared. They did not disappear. Even though scholars, especially economists, would want us to think that dependency theory no longer lives. I think the rapid and ongoing extreme effects of the weather events and global warming on the one hand, and the resources required to address it, also points us to that geographical and spatial division, right? I agree with some scholars who suggest that climate change represents some form of a slow form of violence. But I think it's a bit more deliberate than that. If we consider the antecedents of climate change, as Sunil has just pointed out to us, the antecedents go back as far as enslavement, forms of indentured labor, as well as the history of colonialism, which are processes and systems that transformed how land was utilized and valued, how ecological systems were considered resources on the one hand, but how also our relationship between people and nature and communities was absolutely revolutionized as a result of industrialization and the colonial process that preceded it. Indeed, this happened over many decades and even centuries, but the slowness of it, for me, is less of a quiet materialism than more than one that is deliberate and absolutely loud. If anything, in the course of time, we can look back and trace and see how in many ways the process was a deliberate one to advance material accumulation, bring about death on the part of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, and forms of dispossession to increase the financial stranglehold and dependence of global South countries and formerly colonized countries on the global North. For instance, if we consider the situation of Haiti, now one of the most marginalized countries when it comes to climate change. We can see in a matter of few years in the early 20th century, and in decades afterwards, how much wealth had been extracted, first by the indemnity from France, also by the forms of colonial enterprise that happened in Haiti during its 200 or so years as a colony of France. The invasion of the United States also points us to the shift, or a vector shift even, from one imperial power to the next, from France to the United States. And we saw with the military occupation in the early 20th century, how the United States sought to extract $500,000 in gold reserves. I think it's essential for us how we assess what's happening with the climate crisis. In that the liminal space between colonial and independence projects, in which forms of extraction were initiated, persisted, and were transformed from a state and corporate project to a primary transnational corporate and even increasingly financialized venture. This happened all in a matter of less than a century, these various processes. And from one global empire or one global imperial power to another. The current phase of climate and ecological breakdown linked to these periods can be traced to how societies were reorganized, infiltrated, plundered for resources, and how human and non-human beings were turned and valued as property and capital. By colonization, I mean, obviously, the process of bringing territory and people under stringent forms of control. While colonization as a formal institutional sense ended in many spaces, except in certain places across the Caribbean, we can consider Puerto Rico as an example. But endured in others, we can see that this relationship in economic and spatial terms did not immediately terminate. As Yarima Bonia has elucidated, certain racial, gendered, class, and territorial forms of domination persist today and have reformulated in the present how people, communities are able to, or made less able to respond to those environmental calamities. The colonial carbon economy that also shows ongoing divisions and continuities across space. If we look at a map of the world divided in terms of commodity production and exports, the majority of European states and the United States, in terms of GDP per capita and export structure, are less dependent on these goods than, say, African, Latin American, and formerly colonized countries in the Caribbean, such as Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, and increasingly Guyana. Many of these countries still rely on fossil fuels today to meet basic needs of social and public investment. And over time, since the Second World War, the number of countries that continue to rely on fossil fuels have actually increased. So has colonialism ended? If we consider it as an extractive process in which the colonial carbon economy was initiated and made into what it is today. So it's important for us to recognize, on the one hand, the United States is currently the largest exporter of fossil fuels and has a military that is the largest institutional consumer of hydrocarbons, which has significant implications for climate crisis. But it is economically less reliant. And those countries that have been currently engaging in wars through invasion from the United States, for instance, their resources in terms of hydrocarbons are controlled through military actions and imperial power of the United States. So the colonial carbon economy was created in the image and likeness of Europe in its quest for capital accumulation, which Macarena Gomez Barris has shown quite well and intelligently. While it is the reliance on fossil fuels that we desperately need to change to address the current climate breakdown, some countries and communities will benefit more from this particular shift, while others may fall into economic and social chaos. So I want to suggest, as I conclude, that it is all an imperial design, not one necessarily that is created by putting together puzzles on a map, but one that is created through various forms of displacements, dislocations, and intrusions. So while some countries have significantly more influence than others in terms of how this renewable energy transition is going to happen, in this vein, the United States and the European Commission, who actually created the colonial carbon economy, now are seeking to propose a carbon border adjustment tax, which will impact and disproportionately affect countries, so-called least developed countries, according to the United Nations, in terms of decreasing their income by $5.9 billion, but it only reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 0.1% of global carbon emissions. So I think there are a number of parts there that I wanted to emphasize, and I'm going to stop there, but we can get into some of the discussion a bit more, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you do disagree on some things, because we wouldn't want it to get, I mean, it will obviously always be civil, but I'm glad that we have some things to play around with here. So on one hand, Sunil, you've given us a picture here where, in some sense, imperial rule is associated with underdevelopment rather than an entry into the modern fossil fuel economy, extractivism with the full panoply of infrastructure, say, we might associate with it, and in which actually there's a certain freedom brought about by something like a big dam that promises to release South Asian farmers from the monsoon. And conversely, Keston, you've given us a picture of actually developments in the post-colonial world that occur much more in the likeness of Europe, as you say, and in the persistence of an imperial design that runs right through to the so-called clean energy transition. Well, I'm going to ask you each a question to prod you on this, but my question for both of you is, how much is this, you think, an artifact of the areas of the world that you work on? And therefore, you know, how useful is it to talk about, say, the global South as the formerly colonized world, say, as Keston, you framed it? What kind of unit should we be thinking about? You both point out that thinking with the borders of nation states is very problematic via refugee, climate migrants, or via carbon taxes. But I'm very interested in what kind of units might be more useful. So that's one to keep on the back burner while I prod each of you. My question for you, Sunil, then is, well, what about capitalism then? You know, there's the question that I understand Keston to be in some sense levying at you. What about the C word?
A very good question. What I think two responses. One is the is that the very unevenness of colonial capitalism is what so many anti-colonial activists in South Asia were trying to make sense of and trying to respond to. And in its place, what they put in its place in the end was, well, you can characterize it as well as I can, Liz, a sort of state capitalism. We could debate exactly how to characterize, India from the 40s to the 60s or the 1970s, but it was a question of, it was not an anti-capitalist setup in any sense, but nevertheless, it was one where the state played a leading role in trying to, I think, specifically redress some of the gaps or the unevenness that they had diagnosed in the nature of colonial capitalism. Above all, is precisely the story that Kerstin is telling us. What they wanted to move beyond was India's place as a primary exporting colonial economy, which is why industrialization was so central to that. And I think what I want to emphasize is specifically that in order to realize that project of transcending the colonial economy, that was an energy-intensive process. That was necessarily an energy-intensive process. And that is why, in a way, the very legacy of colonialism that I see as being pivotal to understanding at least the part of the world that I work on, it is inequality. It is economic inequality that was seen as the problem. And a whole range of institutional and policy solutions were sort of brought to bear with greater or lesser success. And of course, we can talk about that. But it was precisely that wish to move beyond just the situation that Kerstin describes, which is the extractive, primary product dependent economy. We can certainly be here all the evening if we're going to discuss how far India did or didn't, to use that one example, manage to transcend that economic position in the world. But I think that was the project. But just to kind of quickly, I think where we're talking about is crucial, because I mean, I think it is exactly the case that though, imperialism and particularly sort of imperial capitalism operated on a global scale, the effects and especially the legacies are very different in India versus island states in the Caribbean. And I think it's not necessarily, I don't think that Kerstin and I are saying different things, but that given where we've focused on, I think the nature of those legacies looks quite different. And I mean, I think, I would, just to complicate things further, I mean, I think the most interesting country as far as thinking about sort of longue durée legacies of empire in relation to the climate crisis is China. I mean, where do we fit China into this story? In particular, given the transformations of the last 20 years, I mean, I think there's no argument that China too was at the receiving end of large-scale systemic imperial exploitation, if not direct colonial rule. And that certainly has been, at the heart of a lot of Chinese arguments since the 1960s and 1970s about historical responsibility for the global climate crisis. And yet, institutionally and geopolitically, that is, China is in a very different position to even India, let alone many other formerly colonized states. And so I think, I think that variegated landscape is perhaps what we're looking at and trying to make sense of here.
Yeah, thank you for those clarifications. And Kerstin, maybe I could throw this back to you then. So you framed this at one point about the idea of the global South, but within the South are, of course, China and India, these the first and third largest national emitters now. But also, I want to push you a little bit on, if we move away, say, from looking at Haiti to, for example, looking at Trinidad and Guyana, as you mentioned, how do we understand the post-colonial dynamics that Sunil is flagging here? So, for example, how do you think about the role of, say, domestic elites in propagating, as you say, a kind of continued imperial design? Is this as linear a kind of trajectory as we might think? And again, you know, are there units beyond either the nation state or the global south that you think might be more useful for us to start reckoning with this question of climate and empire with?
Yeah. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Sunil, for those comments. I think, yes. So I think, let me take your second point first. I think there is an issue, or there is a case to be made for thinking transnationally, obviously, and thinking around how communities of various forms have transnational features, but also are, in certain kinds of ways, they're spatially disconnected from certain sources of power, certain kinds of influence, and so on. So when we think about, for instance, how burdens and costs of climate change impact communities, it's communities that are sometimes very rural. It's communities that also live in certain kinds of areas where they are dependent on the land, they're dependent on the resources of nature to a certain degree to survive. But in many instances, they do not utilize those resources, quote unquote, in the very same way, for instance, that corporations do, right? They utilize them in ways that are much more communal and much more respond to their needs and respond to a certain kind of subsistence, right? So they live in a very kind of different way. So if we are thinking about living and organizing in a very different kind of way, I think thinking at level of community is one way for us to think about climate crisis. And thinking transnationally, obviously, is another way. But I think there is a challenge in doing that, because there are certain kinds of obstacles of, I would say, obstacles of ignorance on the one hand, where even members of sort of the global climate justice movement, if we want to call it that, I don't think it's global in any sense. I think it's very Northern European middle class, and North American in some ways as well, is that there was a large effort to kind of make just ensure that people are not aware of the legacies of colonialism and are not aware of, for instance, of historical effects of industrialization, for instance. So many people in Europe live very comfortable lives today, and there's an increasing number of people who do not, but it has created those obstacles. A part of the Imperial Project was to ensure that people who are at ease with the current status quo continue to be at ease and continue to get the benefit of that. But those who aren't have to continue thinking about their everyday needs. So, I don't know if I'm hoping that I'm making the connection there. In terms of Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, there is, I want to use the example of Haiti to make the comparison with Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. When Haiti it mounted its revolution against France and other imperial powers, because the United States and others were involved, and Spain and so on. When Dessalines looked at the economy, that was the first Haitian, one of the first Haitian leaders. When he looked at the economy, he realized, what are we going to do? We exist in a world that is still controlled, for all intents and purposes, by empires. They still control trade, they control capital, they control all the kinds of means for us to kind of make a living in the world. And so as a result, he thought that the only way to do that was to try to revitalize the plantation economy. Similarly, post-colonial elites who have engaged in extraction in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, had to respond to a world in the sort of post-war period where things were set up in a framework over which they had very limited control, but they had to, as part of the independence project or post-independence project, they had to respond to the needs of their population. And one way only to do that was to continue selling commodities. They tried to do other things, so they tried to industrialize and so on in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which probably was the most successful in the Caribbean. But even that was met by trade lobbies in the United States, for instance. It was met by protectionist measures from Europe and the United States against things like steel. So it is a difficult one that, yes, they continued the extraction and extractivism, but I think it's the circumstances in which the world at that point in time really did not enable them to do other things, right? Ideologically and materially.
Well, I'm very glad that despite my best efforts to start a feud, I actually see that the two of you are much closer, I think, than may have first appeared, in recognizing that a lot of this depends on the different constraints, if you like, that post-colonial states feel they're under, and as well how they feel that they're responding to the needs of their populations. It's just that those sets of constraints are very, very different for small island developing states, sometimes with hydrocarbon endowments, versus somewhere like India and China. So I'm glad to Prakash Kashwan for getting us kickstarted in the chat. Please do start submitting your questions now. Time is flying, but I'm going to ask you, well, at least one more question. Picking up on, Keston, some of your really interesting nods to, if you like, the gaps and flaws in the global climate movement as it currently exists. I'm very conscious that both of you have worked on international organizations and global governance at various points in your careers. And so I'm really interested then in how you see the role of the international system here, whether you see there as being any particular, openings for actual creative and maybe moments of climate justice, or whether you do frame this more in terms of complicity. And I suppose in line with that international focus as well, the other thing that you've both worked on a lot is, Sunil, you spoke very movingly there about climate refugees as, people who are often framed as lacking history, as, prey to just the furies of nature. But in fact, we need to realize that very much are entangled with histories of migration that have been curtailed by borders. Keston, I know you too have worked a lot on the figure of the climate refugee and how it fits in, say, typically white Western imaginaries of what, say, a global Green New Deal might look like. So I guess maybe Sunil first on the international system. And, you've already spoken, I think, a little bit about the climate migrant, but the centrality of that figure as well as we think about the intersection of climate and empire.
In a way, I think the jarring contrast in, on the one hand, we have a sense of gradual progress towards international agreements on climate change mitigation. On the other hand, migration is not really part of that discussion. We're not having international discussions about hospitality and generosity and opening borders to people whose lives are under threat because of a climate crisis that they had absolutely no part in creating. And I think, those tensions, if I have any optimism, it is that those tensions are increasingly stark. Those tensions are no longer papered over. with reference to a sort of international system that will ultimately solve all of these problems. I'm not optimistic about a global compact, or that the international system as it's currently constituted is in a position to take the kind of radical action on climate justice that I think we, certainly all of us on this panel, and I suspect most of us in this room agree is necessary. What I think we see is, it's very interesting here at Yale. We have a new, and I think a very important and well-intentioned project, the name of which, however, makes me bristle, and it's called Planetary Solutions. We all went around and we were talking, the faculty was saying our piece, in fact, in an event a bit like this. And my contribution was to say, we need to understand why referring to planetary solutions will quite rightly raise a lot of hackles, because, what have planetary solutions been used to justify over the last 50, 100, 200, 300 years? Really it is precisely the path that has brought us to our current crisis. What I'm more optimistic about is, of course, all that lies outside the formal international system, but which is sort of deeply networked and transnational, and particularly the kinds of, networks of young people in the global South. Not really subordinated necessarily to what I agree with Kerstin as a very sort of, North-dominated global climate movement, but going back to the 1990s, there are, again, speaking more specifically about the part of the world I know best, I mean, there are all sorts of connections between environmental movements right across South and Southeast Asia, which don't necessarily go through these sort of northern networks. I think about how a place like Penang in Malaysia is from the 1980s, really at the heart, through the Third World Movement and through the Consumers Association of Penang, really a place where, Indian environmentalists, including the CSC folks who are doing the first global environmental state of the citizens environmental report in India, are meeting Indonesian activists and others. And I mean, I feel like at that sort of scale, there is more scope for substantive, diverse voices to be heard on these kinds of questions. But I don't know that that's global. I think very often it is sort of more specific than that. It's often, whether it's the Caribbean or whether it's South and Southeast Asia, it's regions that are very intensively interconnected, by diasporas, by migration, by history.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, Kerstin.
I just want to say I agree with Sunil, and that's it. But yeah, no. So my work on the IMF in particular and its actions towards addressing climate change, and even the UN. Disclaimer: I did do a project for the UN last summer, but it sees, I think, the way these organizations view the climate crisis is as an opportunity, right? And that comes with a certain kind of ideological approach and a certain kind of understanding of what is at stake. So if you view it as an opportunity to accumulate a certain amount of trillions of dollars in corporate dividends and in terms of profit, but that corporatization of the climate crisis, in a sense, leads to and continues what I call the debt and dehumanization and dispossession of communities, because it sees it as a corporate project as opposed to one as a humanitarian project or one as a human concern project. Right, so the IMF, for instance, has during this COVID period have given out huge amounts of loans to several Caribbean countries, and there has been no emphasis except in a couple of them, I think the Bahamas and Barbados, of addressing specific concerns regarding climate change and extreme weather events. Right, but even when the extends forms of support, it is linked to transnational corporate capture of those kinds of projects. So it's about ensuring private enterprise comes in and builds a community solar project, or whatever, kind of project they're talking about. It also is about increasing the debt burdens of many of these countries which can ill afford, because of their levels of marginalization that is directly linked to their colonial history. They're unable to meet the fiscal requirements on the one hand, to actually just utilize their budget to meet their own relief and recovery needs after a major environmental disaster. But the IMF comes in and says, hey, we're going to give you more debt to address the problem, as opposed to some other form of support. So I am not very optimistic that there is a multilateralism. I think the UN talks about a form of new multilateralism to address the climate crisis. I am not very optimistic that the old multilateralism actually worked in the post-war period compared to the one that we're sort of calling for now, which has come under various kinds of rubrics, such as the Green New Deal, right? And I guess the Green New Deal project, I want to sort of say it is a sort of a racialized project, right? And very much because of its nationalist frame, and especially sort of the call for it coming from white majority countries, in which there are huge amounts of disparity internally with respect to environmental justice concerns. But beyond that, the kinds of carbon dumping and the kinds of intrusion in other countries, for instance, you were talking about in the 1990s, the Clinton administration completely decimated the rice industry in Haiti, right? And that was a form of income for rice growers and cultivators and communities that depended on rice. But also it was about introducing more multinationals in the country so that they can carry out their corporate profiteering project. So, I think, and a large part of that is the military. The military being part of the US and European state power has a huge part to do with first causing the problem. I don't think these states going to be our saviors to address the problem.
May I just pick up on what Kirsten's just been saying, actually to ask you a question, Liz, because Kirsten, as you point out, so much of this new multilateralism is about financing renewable energy projects. And Liz, as we know, sometimes we see these articles saying, look, there's reason to be hopeful, and the reason to be hopeful is look at the growth of solar in India. And I know this is something you're working on, and I'd love to hear, especially since I'm also seeing questions in the chat that are sort of trying to talking about renewable energy. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that sort of boosterism as far as solar in India in particular, or more generally in the global South is concerned, and where you think that might fit into this conversation.
Well, thank you. And yes, keep the questions coming in the chat. I think it's really fascinating. And I know, Kirsten, at various points you've probed elements of the clean transition as well. Something that this is the question by Dylan Harris in the chat about whether we will see a sort of resurgence of empire via, say, Africa to being turned into a wind colony. And certainly there is, I think, reason to note that extractivism and the kinds of models that Kirsten is talking about very much continues. So, of course, stay tuned. In 2 weeks, Thea Riofrancos will be talking, I'm sure, about her interesting work on lithium and this new mode of renewables extraction. In some ways, it is an interesting transformation, though, because it has remade tropicality which was long seen as the curse of the global south, that it's just too damn hot, the sun's too damn strong, as a blessing. You know, you look at the International Solar Alliance that India has cobbled together, headquartered in New Delhi, has now 80 some members, mostly post-colonial and mostly in this tropical belt. So there is an interesting potential there, I think, for something of a reorientation. How this actually plays on the ground, though, is exactly the same. Groups that Keston points out bear the brunt always end up being displaced. And as I sometimes ask my students, you know, do you think you'd feel different if your land was grabbed for a solar farm rather than for a coal mine? I actually am not sure that those things are massively different. So I think it's a little more nuanced in the idea that this completely replicates empire. Not least, again, as Sunil, you said, the role of China in absolutely transforming the solar market is very crucial here. But, you know, this is definitely not completely rosy. Well, we're getting lots of exciting questions in the chat, and I'll bundle some of them together. So we have, I think, as Kimberly Thomas points out, Kimberly and Prakash Kashwan have a similar question on what you guys see as actually the key features of the differential patterns, if you like, between different post-colonial regions and how legacies of empire have played out. And I might add on to that Ryan Jobson's quite provocative question, which is this a matter of size? And size as well in a complex way, where, you know, alliances in some ways can get around smallness. I think, for example, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, in the Paris Agreement played a huge role in getting 1.5 degrees right up there, say. So size is not, in and of itself, is not deterministic. But what is the relationship between these differential patterns you're talking about and size, say, or different alliances like BRICS, other kind of South-South blocks?
Just a few sort of scattered thoughts on that. One is that size matters, but I think it matters for distinctive reasons. Size matters in India because the Indian state has itself been a colonizing state since independence. You know, whether we're talking about Kashmir, whether we're talking about sort of, you know, an internal process of marginalizing Adivasi communities, etc. That's very, very different, I think, from the situation of smaller post-colonial states. Yeah, we are really dealing with a state that, first of all, in very clear international relations terms, saw itself as a successor state to the British Raj, not internally, of course, but in its international relations, almost entirely so. At the same time, was trying to sort of forge through non-alignment, etc., a distinctively post-colonial foreign policy. So I mean, there was always that tension. But there's an internal tension too. So I think if we're thinking about, you know, what is the legacy of empire in India, I'm not sure that's the right scale. You know, what is the legacy of empire for particular Adivasi communities who have, in a sense, experienced cumulative environmental injustice, which we can trace back to the Forest Acts of the 19th century, you know, right through to the present day. You know, thinking about the 40-odd million people who've been displaced by large infrastructure projects in India alone since 1947. Very high proportion of them, of course, are from Adivasi communities, and most of those infrastructure projects have been big dams. So I think, you know, I think the ways the questions were framed by Prakash, I think it's just right. It's the variegated legacy to the point where thinking, we do need to think about scale. I mean, I think sort of thinking about, you know, the imperial legacy in India versus the imperial legacy in Caribbean island states, it's a very different scale we're dealing with. And I think that's where Keston's, you know, turn to the idea of community is very important, because I think if we're going to disaggregate, if we're going to think this through, you know, we haven't said anything about the gendered dimension of what these imperial legacies are, but also what, you know, I would love to hear from Keston about climate reparations, but, you know, how might we think about climate reparations as also furthering the project of gender equality, for example? I mean, I think there are all sorts of ways in which we need to, it's a very uneven landscape. And so I think size does matter. And the final sort of, exception to the rule, I guess, echoing what you were saying about the small island states, think about Singapore. Of all post-colonial countries, Singapore is probably the closest to the end of the spectrum where the official narrative, obviously not shared by civil society, the official narrative is a celebration of the colonial legacy and a sense that this is very much building on a colonial legacy. There's a wonderful, wonderful essay by the anthropologist Matthew Schneider-Mayerson called "Some Islands Will Rise." And it is about Singapore and how Singapore's wealth in many ways is part of a project for Singapore to insulate itself against this, not least through the massive importation of sand from riverbanks in Cambodia and in Myanmar. So, I mean, there are ways in which, we need to differentiate between different kinds of imperial legacies and different post-colonial states in terms of their positionality, in terms of their choices, in terms of what scale it is that we're thinking about in terms of, responsibility, but also redress.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, given that Sunil raised this, Keston, maybe I could invite you at this moment to talk a little bit about the idea of climate reparations and how it fits into this quite variegated picture of a post-colonial world in which, we are talking about Singapore in the same breath as we're talking about Haiti, and maybe we absolutely shouldn't be. So, Keston, you're the expert on this, climate reparations. So, tell us about the idea.
Sure. I think I wanted to comment. I think that would lead me to the direct response on climate reparations. The comment on size and survival and how it matters. I think, it is demonstrably challenging for several Caribbean countries which have over 100% of GDP in debt per capita, to try to utilize some of its own fiscal resources to address climate change from its own sort of its own perspective. I mean, it comes to the question of whether sovereignty and the sort of compromise with respect to post-colonial, what the compromise that post-colonial elites made with respect to their sovereignty, and whether there is a question of very constrained sovereignty and or even non-sovereignty, as Yarima Bonia has talked about. So it speaks to, many of the Caribbean countries are going up a creek without a paddle, literally, because and that it leads to sort of a kind of question around an increased level of dependence on the international system for resources, and that increased dependence to address climate change. Every year there's a major hurricane, and there are several and multiple, in more recent years. So what do you do, right? One of the proposals to address that was through forms of regional integration in the Caribbean, which has worked in some cases, but has not worked in a much more, in many more sort of very material ways for countries to address things like climate change, for instance. And there has been, throughout the Caribbean's history, there has been forms of strategic alliances outside of the, things like OASIS, which has been important in sort of climate negotiation, but through, for instance, with Venezuela, through the ALBA project. Those kinds of strategic alliances have been important for one to get resources from non-United States, non-European sort of origins, and to just at any point in time make a sort of calculation as to what would work in these circumstances without, infuriating the United States, right? And yes, obviously, with the kinds of constrained circumstances and the increased dependence on the international system, the question of what is the sort of just approach to addressing the question of climate devastation. And for me, the only kind of approach that is relevant, that removes levels of quid pro quos and removes conditionalities is through form of direct distribution, a non-contingent distribution of reparations to these countries, recognizing the coloniality and colonial history that has led us to this point, and the uneven burdens and costs that the climate crisis, realizes for these countries. How that is going to happen is another question that I am not, it's a political question that requires forms of transnational organizing that goes beyond breaking down those obstacles I talk about, obstacles of ignorance and obstacles of historical indifference.
Thank you so much. Well, we're going to take a final batch of questions then, because we've got some good ones. The first one's from Elena Tiedens, who raises, I think, a really interesting question. National boundaries have come up here as in some sense, a malign force in constraining the movement of maybe people who need to move, say, or as an artifact of colonialism. But she's also asking, what about nationalism as a vehicle for maybe progressive social change? Is there a role for progressive and constructive nationalism? The second one is from Swarnabh Ghosh, who says, picking up something that Sunil sort of hinted at and said, I'll drop that for later. What about periodization and terminology? What do you make of debates about, for example, whether we've entered the Anthropocene, the age of man, versus the Plantationocene, the age of the plantation as the characteristic settler colonial extractivist form, the Capitalocene, and so on, especially given your locations look very different from people, say, like Andreas Malm, who's very firmly located in Europe, or Jason Moore, who's very much rooted in, I think, the Americas and Europe, that locus. So perhaps I will leave those two there. And there's an interesting note as well for everyone from Tim in the chat too. But nationalism and periodization. Sunil, why don't you take us away?
Thank you so much for the nationalism question. It is such an important question. It is one that I have been wrestling with for a decade, I think, in my own work, because I think you've put your finger on something vital. So thinking about some of the water-related dimensions of the climate crisis in South and Southeast Asia, for example, as we know from your colleague Ken Palmerantz's wonderful field-changing 2009 article on the Great Himalayan Watershed, we know that terrain of the Himalayan rivers is pivotal to the future livelihoods of 3 billion people at one estimate. And that's where the nationalism question, I think, becomes very interesting, because on the one hand, what we could look at that and say, it makes no sense that we cannot conceive of the Himalayan rivers as a region, because in a sense, it is such an interdependent social and ecological system. Why can't we think about that as a scale of response and action? But it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, Liz, so Stephen Gardner's sort of third dilemma, which is that is not the scale on which politics are organized. That's not a scale on which mobilization is easy. And that then comes back to in a sense, the second nationalism that you referred to, which is, if we think about environmental mobilization in India, and I'll just use that one example, it has very often been motivated by an alternative sort of nationalism, sometimes often a Gandhian kind of nationalism, not exclusively so, but there is this very, very kind of close link between the Narmada movement, Chipko, and a particular idea of nation. Not the prevailing mainstream idea of nationalism that prevailed in the 80s and 90s, still less the idea that prevails in India today. But nevertheless, I think you're absolutely right that if we look at instances where there has been mobilization around land, around rights, around a different view of nature, my colleague K. Shivaramakrishnan has written about the jurisprudence of the Indian courts in the 2000s. And Shivi has pointed out that there is a very distinctive kind of green jurisprudence that comes out of both the Supreme Court of India and the National Green Tribunals, and both of those are at a moment of reversal and have been for a few years, but nevertheless, there was a moment in the 2000s where it was there. And if you read those judgments, they are underpinned by a particular kind of nationalism, a particular vision of rights, including the rights of the non-human, including the rights of people to their sacred landscapes, that has everything to do with a particular kind of, national constitutional thinking. So I think you're right. And I think that's true in other parts of Southeast Asia that I know as well. If you think about Indonesia, I think the same is true. There's a very interesting work by Anna Gade on the what she calls green pesantren, and this idea of a kind of Islamic Indonesian nationalism being really at the core of the environmental movement that has emerged over the last 2 decades or so. So I think it's an open question, and the only thing that makes it tricky, of course, is that the definition of what nationalism is, it has in a country like India and many other countries been so taken over by the far right that it's difficult to sort of square these things or to think of them together. And I do think the migration question is the one that always gives me pause, because I feel like that is the level at which borders have done profound harm and violence to many people who are denied the opportunity to perhaps seek safety elsewhere. So we probably don't have time to get into Myanmar and all of the different manifestations of the crisis there, but I think that's not irrelevant to the question you've asked. It's a great question. Swarna, of course, I think the periodization question is crucial, because I think whichever periodization we choose leads us to different answers about the sort of responsibility question, about what is causing this, and therefore perhaps what the ways out might be before us. And all I say to that is that this is going to remain unresolved, and I mean we are no doubt going to continue to sort of debate whether this is the capitalist scene, whether actually it's a much later phenomenon that we really need to think about, sort of post 1945, which is also part of the capitalist scene, but perhaps a distinctive phase in the capitalist scene. Or whether that is still too limiting to kind of encompass all of the different manifestations of the ecological crises that we face.
And Keston, would you like to comment at all on nationalism and its opportunities, or the periodization question?
I think the first one, I think it's an interesting concern, because I think we have to sort of understand the current moment first, right? And how nationalism is being used as a kind of racist project in the current moment, that it also coincidentally or incidentally is correlated with levels of climate denialism, right? Especially in the United States, right? So the question of progressive nationalism is, I think, in the sort of post-World War, I think, oh my gosh, I think one of your colleagues at Chicago in political science, why don't I remember her name? That the book on that she's written why don't I remember the name? World Making an Empire.
Oh, Adam Getachew, yeah.
Yes. That book points to how progressive nationalism worked in post-colonial societies where communities that were, facing colonial ruin and so on, they formed forms of to address their needs and social and political needs. There was a form of progressive nationalism that was taken up in many Caribbean countries, right? So we had Michael Manley, we had Eric Williams in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and we had a number of other sort of pro-nationalists that, tried to go along a certain, in the case of Manley, he tried to go in the route of a form of democratic socialism is what he called it. And the United States was saying, no, that was not going to happen. So in the case, its size and smallness in this case also is very, very, very critical in how you build your political projects. In the context that you're in, it is a challenge to move in a particular direction, especially in the case of the climate crisis, where there are so many divisions in terms of how things are conceptualized and who is responsible, historical responsibility, and so on. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that it necessarily can help in the case of the Caribbean outside of a sort of regional project that is much more activated than the current one. I have no comments on the second question because I don't utilize those terms. And so, yeah, although I think obviously periodization is extremely important.
Well, we have an amazing set of questions from my colleague, Frederick Alberton Johnson, that I think would definitely extend us well beyond the scope of the time, sadly. Perhaps I'll leave it for our audience to mull over. Must decarbonisation also involve a rejection of the 19th century ambition to win freedom through the mastery of nature? I think this question of what our revised relationships with non-human nature look like is an excellent one. How do we reconstruct the project of justice in a world of planetary boundaries? And is justice compatible with what it seems like we need, a project of retreat and repair? I think I leave all of those for you to mull over and hopefully discuss on future panels. But Keston, Sunil, this has been absolutely fantastic. I wish that I was taking you out for dinner so we would carry on, getting steadily drunker and getting into fisticuffs about some of this. But thank you so much for helping us inaugurate CIGU. It's been a great, great pleasure to listen to you both.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun. Thank you.
I think so too. I think, and there weren't very many disagreements. So yeah, so thank you. It was absolutely lovely.
It was a pleasure. And thank you, Neil, for initiating us. I spot your face has popped back up.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. And please, again, just check back on our website, our preliminary website, cigu.info, for further details about some of the events that were mentioned previously, and additional events will be announced probably by next week. So, and thanks again to Keston and Sunil, and to Liz for guiding us in a very wide-ranging discussion. Thanks to all of you for being here, and we look forward to continuing this work together in collaboration with all of you and with all of our students. Thanks again, everyone. Be safe, be well, and to be continued.